What are reasonable expectations for year one of this new Jets leadership? I think they're higher than you might expect, and I'll explain why today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, January 29th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from ganggreennation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. On today's show, we have our weekly mailbag. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Let's begin our first question. How do you envision the Jets perform this upcoming season under Glenn and Moogie? What are you looking for in terms of next season to be deemed a success? And that's a great question. And, we've talked a lot about how 2025 in many ways for the Jets is probably going to be a reset year because all of the cap maneuvering the last 2 years, the bill is going to come due this year if we assume Rodgers is not back. Now, if Rodgers comes back, you're in a tough spot because if you're bringing back a 41-year-old quarterback, you should do it because you're trying to win big. But the team showed it really can't win big with its current setup. So let's put that scenario aside. Let's just assume Rodgers is not coming back. Expectations will be low. But I think the Jets, I would take the over on 5 wins. You gave me an over under 5 wins, which was the Jets' win total in 2024. I'd take the over because I think, first of all, you're going to have better coaching. Now, I know like Aaron Glenn's a first-year head coach, but I think based on what we saw last year, I know everybody always says that when they fire their coach, we're definitely going to have better coaching. And it doesn't always pan out that way. But I think it's clear the Jets are going to have better coaching this year. Aaron Glenn does not have to be a great coach. Aaron Glenn doesn't even have to be a good coach for the Jets to have better coaching this season because they'll actually have a head coach. They won't have a guy who's really a defensive coordinator just kind of pretending he's the head coach, which is what the Jets had last year with Jeff Ulbrich for much of the season. But if you go beyond that, this is not a team that has terrible talent. Now, it's not a team. Last year there was a lot of people pumping them up, saying this is a Super Bowl team. I think we know that's not true. The Jets did not have Super Bowl talent last year, but there are good players on this team. There's Garrett Wilson, there's Sauce Gardner, there's Elijah Vera Tucker, there's Michael Carter II, who had a bad season, but still a very good slot corner. You can go down the list. Breece Hall. There are quality players on this roster. Maybe not enough to be a Super Bowl team. And there's a big question mark at quarterback, and it's not entirely clear how the Jets are going to be able to fill that during the course of the offseason. That, of course, is a critical component. But there are enough there are enough pieces on this team that the Jets should not be horrible next season. So, I think a lot of it's going to come down to the things that most seasons come down to. How easy is the schedule? How does your team do injury luck wise? Things like that. But I think that this is kind of like a middle of the pack team. And I think it's actually good for the Jets because this year they came in with expectations that were too high. You always want to underpromise and overdeliver. This year, the Jets were a team that overpromised and underdelivered. I think the residual effect of that, people will say, well, they only went 5-12. They only went 5-12 in 2024. They lost Rodgers. The quarterback situation is unclear. I think the Jets are going to be perceived as one of the weakest teams in the league heading into 2025. I don't think that's true. I think this is kind of more of a middle of the pack team. And I think better coaching, it could produce results. Now, what should our expectations be? One of the things I look at is what should you reasonably expect from the team? But another aspect of this is if this is a good coaching staff, shouldn't they beat that? Shouldn't they overperform that? And again, some of that comes down to luck. Some of that's about, do you avoid injuries? Does the schedule break for you in a favorable way? Of course, that stuff matters. But if we're saying the Jets should be like a 500-esque team, then if they have good coaching, shouldn't Darren Glenn get them over the top? I mean, here's an amazing fact for you. The Jets have not made the playoffs in 14 years. I'm sure you know that. The Jets have not played a meaningful game in the final week of the regular season since 2015. So it's not just a 14-year playoff drought. It's a 9-year drought of even playing a meaningful game, being alive the last week of the season. So with all that, maybe my answer right now is the Jets to play a meaningful Week 18 game. because it hasn't happened since 2015. We're going on the 10th. We'll be in the 10th anniversary of the Jets being alive, having a chance to make the playoffs in the final week of the season. So maybe that's my preliminary goal for the Jets in 2025. It's a very modest goal, but I think it's achievable if the team handles things the right way. That could adjust based on certain factors, how the Jets handle the offseason. But I gotta be honest with you, it's in the league where 7 teams make the playoffs in each conference and there are only 16 in each conference. There's really no excuse to not at least be in the mix until the end of the season. So I think that's probably where I'd start. I may revise that if as we move forward. Our next question, John, on a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being how excited we would have gotten if we got Mike Vrabel, 1 being what in the world is this team doing? This is an Adam Gase level hire. Where would you put your excitement level for this new regime? I'm personally at about a 5, cautiously optimistic with good league buzz surrounding Aaron Glenn, but also disappointed we hired yet another first-time defensive-minded coach. What are your thoughts? I'd probably be about a 6. So I had the top tier guys. There were 4 guys who I thought were really top tier candidates. One was, and I know he's not a very exciting name, Mike McCarthy was at the top of my list because he's a proven head coach. And above all else, the Jets have really struggled identifying coaching talent. So if you don't really know what you're looking for, get the proven thing. Even though Mike McCarthy comes with his flaws, even though he's not a great coach, he would have been at the top of my list. To a lesser extent, that was true of Mike Vrabel. Mike Vrabel did a good job in Tennessee. I think he was the one. He was the one guy who could have come in and completely changed the organizational structure of the Jets. And then the 2 other guys would be Ben Johnson and Todd Monken, just because I like their backgrounds, I like their offensive visions. So that was my top tier. Then you have your second tier, and then you have your tier of guys who are just horrible. The guys I would not want at all would be the Cliff Kingsburys of the world, or the Arthur Smiths of the world, the guy Matt Nagy, guys who just completely failed during their first stint as head coaches, and guys who really have not given you any reason to believe they'd be anything different. Guys who are good coordinators but bad head coaches. In that middle tier, I think Glenn was at the top of my list. I think Glenn and Brian Flores were kind of at the top of my list, where there's enough reason to be skeptical there, but there's also a lot of positive. And I think with Glenn, it's easy to fall into the trap of saying, well, it's another first-time defensive-minded coach. And, a lot of the things that were said about Glenn were said about Robert Saleh when the Jets hired him. They were said about Todd Bowles when the Jets hired him. This guy's going to be a culture builder. That's one of the buzz phrases people have for defensive coaches. But just because Saleh failed, just because Bowles failed while here, that doesn't necessarily mean Glenn is going to have the exact same career trajectory. He's his own person. He's not Todd Bowles. He's not Robert Saleh. He comes with a different background, a different skill set, and he has every opportunity to succeed here. My views on Glenn could change quite a bit based on who some of the hires he has. It could change quite a bit based on some of the personnel moves this offseason. I do think Glenn's a bit of a blank slate, and when you have a blank slate, you hope for the best. But you don't really know for sure until the guy hits the ground, and that begins in the offseason with the personnel moves the Jets will need to make and the coaching hires the Jets need to make. So we're something worth watching as we move forward. But I'd put it at about a 6. I agree. He was kind of like a middle of the pack hire, but I give him a little bit of a boost because I think he was at the top of the middle of the pack. Now, had you on the Locked On Jets podcast, I don't think Aaron Rodgers could come back, but could the Jets possibly make his cap situation more palatable? If he's willing to take a pay cut, it's possible. And I'll explain how as we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Prize Picks. The big game is almost here, and there's no better way to make it more exciting than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings awarded, Prize Picks makes it fun and simple to get in on the action. And here's how it works. You pick more or less on at least 2 player projections, and if you're right, you could win up to 1,000 times your cash. Prize Picks even has a free pick for the big game where one of the starting quarterbacks needs to throw for 1 yard to win. Pair that with one more correct pick, and you are cashing out. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Our next question here on our weekly mailbag is from Jerry. He asked, John, if the Jets were willing to bring back Rodgers and if he was willing to take another pay cut, is there any way to mitigate the potential $60 million in dead money in 2026 without spreading it out over more years? Okay, so this is a really good question. It's a complex issue, so I'm going to try and explain it as best I can. So as you may know, if Aaron Rodgers retires this year, the Jets have a $49 million dead money hit. And if he retires, if he plays another season under his current contract and retires after next season, the Jets would then get a $63 million dead money hit in 2026. So let me explain to you how these dead money hits come. Now, there's a reason Aaron Rodgers would have a $49 million dead money hit in 2025 if he retires right now. And that's simple. It's that over the last two seasons, Aaron Rodgers has received $75 million combined salary. Okay. However, of that $75 million, only $26 million has counted against the Jets salary cap. So there's there's a tab of $49 million left that the Jets will need to pay, because that's simply because when you think about dead money, it's about money that the player's already been paid but hasn't counted against your cap. So that's the reason Rodgers has $49 million in dead money for 2025. The reason it would rise to $63 million in 2026 is that Rodgers would have another $37.5 million salary, but only $23 million would count against the cap. So that's an extra $14 million we're adding to the $49 million dead money. And that's how we get to $63 million in 2026. So essentially, it's just the unpaid tab. It's what we've already given Rodgers, but what hasn't been charged against the cap. So the base number we would go with is 49, because that $49 million still is unpaid. Is from his salary from 2023 and 2024. So that's the lowest we're getting if Rodgers plays one more season. If he reduces his salary, then if he adjusts his salary, it depends on how they do it. If he's willing to take a massive pay cut, yes, you would reduce that money you would reduce that number from 63 million. It depends on how big of a pay cut he would take, but we're not getting below 49 million in 2026. So I hope that explains it. Sometimes dead money seems like this really complex, unapproachable thing, but it's actually much simpler than that. It's really just money the players already been paid that the team hasn't been charged against the cap. And that's how we get to those numbers. That's how we get to 49 million in 2025 if he retires, and 63 million in 2026. It's actually that simple. Next question from Michael. John, I appreciate your insightful commentary. Well, thanks, Michael. I appreciate that. I'd like your thoughts on umpires and referees in the NFL. They've made a lot of progress improving through the years, and they have some very tough and demanding positions they need to fulfill. However, millions of dollars are on the line with each NFL games for the teams and individual performances, and there have been some very controversial calls lately. How can the NFL continue to justify keeping the referees as part-time employees? Should they not be reimbursed enough to allow them to work exclusively through the NFL and train when the season ends rather than going to other jobs in the offseason? It seems that their position is important enough that the NFL's investment would be worthwhile. Also, if tennis can evaluate ins and outs so precisely with their technology, why could the NFL not mimic that to evaluate ball position with, say, chips inside for the football? The critical 4th and 1 call in the Bills-Chiefs championship game may have been easier to make. So lots of questions for Michael. Michael's real issues with the referees, and I think we've all got issues with the referees. Should they go currently the officials are part-time. They work on Sundays or Mondays, and then they have real regular jobs. This has been a point of contention for a number of years. I don't get the sense, though, that the issue is that they aren't training enough. I get the sense that the issue is just the players are really big and really fast. And the other aspect of this is just we have more methods to scrutinize them than we have ever had in the past, because, we have podcasts like this. There's sports blogs now. There's Twitter, so all kinds of social media, message boards. These things did not exist 50 years ago. So a big blown call would get scrutinized, but we didn't have the scrutiny on a weekly basis, on a call-to-call basis like we do right now. Here's what I would do. I don't think that I don't think that these guys need to go full time. I just think the referee assist needs to be able to change any call, because isn't that the most logical thing? And the NFL's been slow to implement this. A couple of years ago they brought in the referee's assistant, but they didn't really explain it. It wasn't really clear what they were doing, and now they've offered a little bit more insight. But there's still some calls they can't change. My understanding is they can't even change a face mask call, which is a pretty obvious one. They definitely could not change a blatantly blown pass interference. I mean, I don't want them to like change ticky-tack pass interference calls, but like in a blatant one, like the one in the Rams Saints NFC Championship game 6 years ago, I think that would be something that would be worth exploring. So I think that like they now have kind of like the sky judge who quickly reviews plays and can message it down to the officials. That makes sense. Let's do that. When the current iteration of instant replay was brought into the league in 1999, they had a very strict challenge system. You only got 2 challenges per game, and there were very specific things you could do. And that system made sense for the technology we had in 1999. Now we have the technology to pretty much review every single call in real time. So why don't we take advantage of that? And the second point Michael made is, why don't we put a chip in the ball so that we can judge the spot? And you know something, Michael, you beat me to that, because that was a point I've been meaning to raise on this podcast. And you mentioned in tennis, I've gone to the U.S. Open a couple of times in New York in August, and they don't have any humans making calls. They have an automated system where they can tell you whether the ball was in or out. I always wondered why the NFL doesn't do that for like the situations where the receiver's trying to tap 2 feet down, because that seems like a pretty easy. The technology seems very similar. But also, yeah, you could put a chip in the ball. I'm sure they have the technology to put some sort of tracking device in the ball and figure out where it is and help improve the spot. And this is the frustration, is that the NFL has technology to do this so much better. And I think we'll probably head in that direction at some point. There used to be this argument that, oh, well, the human error is part of the game. You always used to hear that as an argument against use of instant replay. And that always struck me as kind of ridiculous, because why would you want human error to decide a game? A human error should not decide a team season. Those games go down in infamy. If you've got the technology to correct calls, you should use it. And the NFL doesn't utilize this technology nearly as effectively as it should. So I think that, I'm with you on that, Michael. I think that the NFL should certainly change things. Certainly change how they utilize these things. Next question is from Lou. John, top tier AFC quarterbacks: Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, and Joe Burrow. Second tier: Justin Herbert, CJ Stroud. Up and coming: Drake May, maybe Bo Nix. How did the Jets compete with either a 41 or 42-year-old Rodgers, or who do they get? Well, this may not be an answer people like, but I think that this is not a year where the Jets are probably going to be able to figure out their long-term quarterback solution. I mean, look, they've shown that they can't win with Rodgers in his current iteration. They got Rodgers just too late in his career. If they got Rodgers 5 years earlier, this team would be in that top tier. But he's at a point now where he's at a lower tier quarterback and declining. He's probably at this point a low-level starter, and he's probably going to get worse if he comes back in 2025. Rodgers can't be the option, but I don't know that any of these quarterbacks in the draft class are really that good. I think for the Jets, what you're probably going to need to do is look to what Minnesota did, and try and find. You've got a good offensive line here. You've got some quality skill players: Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall. Try and find a talented quarterback who's still relatively young, like the Vikings did with Sam Darnold, and try and put him into the right ecosystem. And then I'm not saying like you go with that guy. And I'm not saying you look at Sam Darnold's not the guy. What Minnesota did was they found a guy who was cheap and put him into their system, and it worked really well. You don't want to you want to find someone you're buying low on, not somebody you're buying high on. And you try and put him into a good system. You try and put him onto a team with a good offensive line. Hopefully, you'll hire a good offensive coordinator. You'll have good skill players, and try and make it work that way. So I think that's probably going to be the best course of action for the Jets. And we'll probably talk about some of the options for that as we continue here in the weeks ahead. Now, ahead here on today's episode of Locked On Jets, let's talk about the effect Davante Adams had on this team. I think it's clear that trade was ill-advised. I'll tell you the biggest reason it was ill-advised, though, as we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. So also you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now this is Taxes. Get an expert with now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. We're doing our weekly mailbag. Our next question comes from Tom. He writes, John, I just did some quick and depressing thinking and fact checking. We won 3 games post Davante Adams trade, and he lit it up in all 3 games. He averaged 125 yards and 8 receptions per game and had 4 touchdowns in those 3 games, 2 of which were one-score games. And if we had lost just twice more, we'd have the first overall pick. Basically, what I'm saying is that it's totally conceivable we could have had the first overall pick, 2 third-round picks, and 2 fifth-round picks in this draft, and not owe Davante Adams $70+ million over the next 2 years. So in retrospect, what was the worst decision? Trading for Rodgers or trading for Davante? Well, that's a good question. I think the more damaging move was trading for Rodgers, just because it led the organization to kind of restructure everything. The Jets, even though they had a 7-10 season in 2022, they were making real progress building around their young core. That's the thing I will never understand, is why they got away from that. The thing about trading for Aaron Rodgers in 2023 is that the move itself, the decision itself to trade for Aaron Rodgers, I don't think it was really a bad one. I think the way the Jets handled it, though, was terrible. It's one thing if you evaluate things and you say, we can get Aaron Rodgers. We think he's the best quarterback available. You do it. I think there's still a case to be made that of the quarterbacks who were available for the Jets in the 2023 offseason, Rodgers was the best. The problem is you can't do it at any cost. I think the Jets just felt that if they added Aaron Rodgers, they were a Super Bowl team no matter what. So any price, any condition made it worth it. And you can't operate that way. There has to be a point where you're willing to walk away. I mean, you look at what happened that offseason. First of all, the Jets were kind of frozen in what they could do in free agency because that trade took forever to get completed. They also gave up too much for Rodgers. I mean, the thing is, there was no reason the Jets should have given up any sort of tangible asset for Rodgers because the Packers had to trade him. The Packers gave him a bad contract. And the Packers, were on Jordan Love was entering the final year of his rookie deal. The Packers were in big trouble because, if they didn't get Rodgers out of there, Jordan Love would never get on the field. He would not have stayed in Green Bay after his rookie deal expired. So the Jets bailed the Packers out. So I still don't understand why the Jets had to give up anything tangible for Rodgers, because the Packers just wanted to get Rodgers off the team, and there was no other bidder. There was no other team that was interested. And beyond that, the time frame needed to be different. You couldn't let this thing dominate the whole offseason. You needed to have a date. The Jets needed to go to Rodgers once they got permission to speak with him and said, look, we'd love to have you, but you got to make a decision right now. You got to make a decision by X date. And if you can't, then we'll move. We no hard feelings, but we have to move forward because we need to know what we're doing. They didn't do that. They also needed to they needed to make it clear. Look, we want you here. We're going to build the team as best we can, but we're not going to get Allen Lazard. We're not going to go get your favorite players. We're going to build you. You're going to join our current core, and we're going to keep building that core out. And we're going to try and win a Super Bowl. But this is not going to be a 2-year build. This is not going to be like a 2-year window. We're going to keep building, thinking long term, and we hope that you'll win the Super Bowl with us. But we're not going. We're not going to add a bunch of players in their 30s. That's what I think the Jets should have done. The way they handled it. So look, it's clear that was the more damaging of the 2 trades. I think the less logical trade was Adams, though, because for all the issues that existed with the way the Jets traded for Rodgers, you still at the time could see a path to it succeeding. During that era 2 years ago when I was doing shows during the offseason, I had a lot of reservations about it, but I also said that, there was a clear way it could succeed in a big way for the Jets. There was a plausible path that this could be a success. There was never a plausible path for this Davante Adams trade to be a success. In the moment, it made no sense. The Jets were 2-4, and they weren't a good team. There was no way you could look at the Jets through the first 6 weeks of the season and say that team is a wide receiver away from being a Super Bowl team. They were 2-4. The team was clearly in free fall. But it got to a point where the Jets felt it slipping away, and I think Woody just panicked and just tried to do whatever he could to stop it. The deal for Adams was crazy, though. It was crazy that they gave up a 3rd-round pick and took on the entire contract. They didn't even restructure the deal. I mean, that's the reason Adams ended up with the Jets. The Jets were the only team that was willing to give up a high pick and take on the full contract. Every other team needed the Raiders to eat some of the contract. But again, the Jets were desperate. And that's what happens when you get desperate. You lose perspective of price. But at that point, the season was not going the Jets' way. I mean, yeah, I guess like maybe they could have like got snuck into the wild card or something like that if they got hot. But you knew that was not a Super Bowl team, and they still did it anyway. It was just you did it to rent Davante Adams for like 3/4 of a season. He gave up a 3rd-round pick. That was just crazy in the moment. So I think Rodgers was more damaging. I think the decision that was just dumber in the moment was trading for Adams, because it never made sense. I mean, the thing is, like, Adams is still a good player, and the move made no sense. So that tells you everything you need to know. Adams actually held up his end of the bargain pretty well. He was good with the Jets as a receiver, but the deal was still bad. So that tells you how bad this trade was. The fact that like the player actually lived up to his side of the bargain, and the deal still is horrible. That speaks volumes, I think. Our last question: how much are refs getting paid off by the NFL for making sure the Chiefs get to the Super Bowl this year? Multiple bad calls in both playoff games involving the Chiefs. Yeah, I mean, I've read some people on social media say, well, the league's got a problem because there's a perception the Chiefs are favored by the officials. That's not a perception. I mean, you watch the games, they are. And like, the Chiefs fans like love to throw these statistics out there. Like, well, the Chiefs look at the penalty stats in the league. The Chiefs don't benefit from calls in an inordinate way. It's like, yeah, but that doesn't tell you anything. How many blown calls in key spots? How many shaky calls in key spots did the Chiefs get? More than any team in the league. And that's just, the league has an issue with a credibility issue with this, because that's how the games are called. And the one thing I'll say is that, that's just the way it is. Stars get calls. Patriots got calls when Brady was there. Look how many more roughing the passer penalties the Jets benefited from with Aaron Rodgers than they did with Zach Wilson or Sam Darnold. The officials are very deferential to stars. I mean, it's true across all leagues. I mean, if you were around during the 90s, you may remember Michael Jordan, the calls he got from officials. These guys just benefit. The big guys. There's a famous story. You want to go back a really long time. You want to go back like 80 years or so. Ted Williams was batting. Ted Williams, maybe the greatest hitter who ever lived. He was a left fielder for the Boston Red Sox, and he took a pitch, and it was like right down the middle. And it was like clearly in the strike zone, and the umpire called it a ball. And the catcher turned around to the umpire and said, "What are you talking about? That was clearly a strike." And the umpire said, "If Ted Williams didn't swing, it couldn't be a strike, because Ted Williams' eyes are so good and his plate discipline is so good that he would only swing at strikes." And I think like that is a good anecdote to explain why a lot of these big names get calls. But yeah, like it's frustrating to watch, because it's clear the Chiefs are benefiting from these calls in a way no other team is. And the league has to deal with the credibility issue this thing creates. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening, so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.